First off, I'd like to thank Harold. Your story and many stories that we encounter, especially with, we call them victims. I tend to sometimes call them clients. Have you ever heard me talk about, because the courage that it takes for them to come forward. Again, your story empowers me. It also makes me realize when we're training law enforcement that law enforcement needs to understand, to really listen to what the client is saying and how to service them properly. So when I was asked about this topic, about the good and the bad for law enforcement, obviously for my office wife, Ronnie Singh, who was there, who prosecuted a case that we all are very familiar with, Jamar Jeter, and technology actually played into this a lot. And you have a story of a client that tells you that, hey, I was here at this particular time, and I had this telephone in my hand, and this is what we did. And we said, okay, we have this piece of evidence, this cell phone. Then we have another phone. Then we have another phone. And all of a sudden, we realized that this evidence that we had, these cell phones, actually do corroborate that evidence. It actually says this phone and this phone were put together at the same time. They were together, except sometimes they were apart. Well, if you can imagine the client explaining to us that during that time that she was either on the track, as the places that are known to where prostitution activity occurs, or they were back at the hotel. So this really played into a really key role, especially in some of these things. And again, technology has also hurt us. Hurt us in the way that I know a lot of us, and we see things sometimes a little differently. Like I know some people thought when my Red Book went down that, oh my God, there's going to be a flood of people that are going to start working the streets again. I know different groups came about, and I said, it's really only going to change for a minute. And we saw that with Backpage. And then all of a sudden when Backpage came, and I remember I was sitting right next to one of my colleagues, and I said, hey, look, we're getting ready to post the ad on Backpage, and there's this little sensor that this thing says that, hey, they're about to take down Backpage. And I started reading more into it, and I go, they said it's going to be done. It's going to be over. And then again, I heard the same messages, oh my God, now we're going to be forcing these people back onto the street, and they're not going to be protected, and their in-calls, out-calls, they're not going to be they're safe out there. I go, absolutely not. You're going to see one spot move to another spot. And that's exactly what happened. It was like overnight. It literally happened overnight, where you saw all these postings for commercial sex went from the escort sites right onto the dating sites. So you can imagine that someone figured this out very quickly. Now, there's a new little game out there. It's basically to confirm that this is you or this is your ad, and Backpage is trying to cooperate with law enforcement to the best of their ability. I challenge that sometimes. And now they're adding different links. And so I was hoping to have someone from Facebook to talk about this, or Instagram, is now they're putting this extra link on there to confirm that this is them, but the link really doesn't go anywhere. But again, it adds a fingerprint. It adds a fingerprint, but basically it allows us back to the IP address. So these things with technology helps us, and then they hinders our investigations because it makes it sometimes very difficult to go forward with these cases. Our cell phones, imagine that, would you ever ask a trafficker into your home? No. Would you ever allow an exploiter, a trick, into your home? No. But this is what's going on with technology. This is what's occurring currently right now. You see these things as far as postings that say, hey, come see me, or these solicitations on Facebook or other social media sites, but they're allowed your young children, and these are the outreaches that these perpetrators do. And it's amazing that how many people that we let through the door, especially with not monitoring what our children are looking at currently right now. Right now it's very difficult because now we have these new, my fear is we are several steps behind every time new technology comes forward. and I'm talking about the famous iPhones. Very difficult for us as law enforcement to get into. We eventually do get into it, but it's challenging. And especially one thing that I learned, and I go back to the case that Ronnie and I worked on, was I learned something immediately. And anyone in law enforcement understand this, is that we were told that you did a search warrant on this phone already once. 6 months now, we couldn't get into that phone. 6 months later, we could get into that phone. And basically, it's because technology had not caught up to us. So those in law enforcement, I'm telling you right now, if you have a phone and it hinders onto your investigation that you don't know if you can get into it or not, come back and revisit it every 6 months, because you'll be amazed that you can actually get into it. Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. Next, we'll turn to David, and the question is, in what ways does technology help or hinder the fight against human trafficking?
I'll come up to the podium too. So just to give a kind of like level set a little bit about when I talk about this technology, I work, obviously I work for IBM. It's a product called I2. It's very well known in the law enforcement realm. It was born and bred in the intelligence space almost 26 years ago. So it's been around for a long time. Essentially what it does is it draws a picture. It draws a picture with data behind it. And it shows you obvious connections, non-obvious connections through like a multidimensional link analysis solution. And so back, 26 years ago, this was developed for terrorism. It was developed to try to track down the bad guys. And it's still doing that today, but it's just a different use case. So our use case is spread from financial industry, where we're trying to catch fraudsters, to still doing counterterrorism, as well as human trafficking. So this picture that it draws is all backed by real data and allows a person, human being, behind the computer screen to quickly go through data and try to discover where the threat is coming from, whether it be the person or location. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of what it is I'm talking about. And like Lieutenant was mentioning, it's kind of a double-edged sword with data and technology. It's, people that want to commit crimes, and fraudsters and crooks and human traffickers, they leverage data and they leverage technology. But myself and as part of IBM, we have to do that as well. It's always described at IBM that data is the new natural resource, and that goes for using technologies like I2. And the reason why is that data is just, there's so much data, we're creating data all the time. And to kind of sift through the noise of that data and try to figure out where we need to focus our time is really the goal of an analyst, whether it be an intel analyst or someone that's trying to stop crime from occurring. And so 2 quick examples. Organizations using I2 specifically for human trafficking. It's an organization called Stop the Traffic. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. And one of their focuses is using data to determine hotspots and trends, location-based. And what they do with that information is they actually use targeted social media campaigns to hit people in that region, the communities in that region, to bring awareness. So that awareness is kind of pushing it back onto the community, saying, hey, it's a problem in your area. You need to know and identify what human trafficking, because it takes many forms, as we discussed, and to put it on them essentially to take action, call the local law enforcement. So in one recent use of this targeting, they were able to reach 43% of the community that was really heavily inundated with human trafficking in California. And being able to bring that to the forefront of their minds and ultimately bring it to law enforcement. So another perspective that you can take using data is to focus on the person. As a former cop, data-driven, intelligence-led was kind of what we did. But this one specific organization was it's called Deliver Fund. I don't know if everybody's familiar with them, UK-based. And what they do, they're all former counterterrorism intel analysts, and so they have that mentality, that intel-led sort of focus. And they're actually being leveraged because they take all this different data from all different sources, well, in my world, I call it disparate data sources. And they try to bring it all into one single pane of glass. And when they do that, this one organization was able to, law enforcement came to them in a double homicide, human trafficking crime. And within 27 days, they were able to capture the bad guys through the use of this organization's data that they were able to leverage. So I guess my general point is that as these nefarious characters continue to change in the way they do things, we have to change with them. We have to change our tactics. And having a platform that can be flexible enough to adjust as we see those tactics change is our real goal. So thank you for that.
Next, I'd like to invite Jennifer Palantir.
So when I was asked this question about the ways in which technology can either help or hinder the fight against trafficking, I was really struck by some examples from my work more in the direct victim services side, where we would actually see the same kinds of technology being used really on both sides. And I came to see technology almost as a neutral tool, because on the one hand, traffickers can be incredibly inventive and innovative in their use of technology, often in ways that were never the intended purpose of that technology. But at the same time, these technologies can provide opportunities for the counter-trafficking field. And so as one very specific example, we would see, when I was in my work at Polaris, these cases of labor trafficking in traveling magazine sales crews. And this is a kind of trafficking that's kind of unique to the US. We don't see it as much internationally, but we will see this as a pretty common labor trafficking scheme. And oftentimes, traffickers will use online communication platforms and social media, both to recruit victims and to identify their targets, but also to coordinate and facilitate their operations. They're operating these multiple fleets of vans, and they would use these social messaging platforms to coordinate those operations and to provide each other with tips and suggestions on how to better control the victims that they were exploiting. But on the flip side, we would also see that many of the survivors on these same labor trafficking crews would use those social media platforms to reach out for help and assistance and to report their cases. Often this was the only safe way they had to communicate. And so technology can play kind of that double role, where on the one hand you can absolutely use it to control and monitor and facilitate exploitation, but it also presents these opportunities for people to reach out for help or to provide each other as survivors with support if they're in rural or remote areas. And I'm particularly interested, like David, in the ways in which we see the use of technology creating these really robust data footprints. On the one hand, you'll absolutely see technologies, think of things like the dark web or cryptocurrencies, where the role is in some ways to obfuscate that data footprint. But oftentimes, the use of technology can lead to very robust data signals that the counter-trafficking field can use, both to increase risk for traffickers, as well as to increase identification of trafficking cases and support for survivors. And we'll see this, for example, in the finance community, where as traffickers move away from cash-based systems and start to use credit cards or mobile payment systems, that presents an opportunity for actors in the finance space to detect those cases and to help law enforcement build evidence of financial crimes where it might be very hard to prove a trafficking case. And so that use of technology, while it can facilitate and make it easier for traffickers to generate profit, can also be a tool that the counter-trafficking field can use. And so in a moment, I'll talk a little bit more about what specifically Palantir does to help its philanthropic clients make better use of their data. Thank you.
Great. Next, I want to invite Sarai to the podium. Again, I'll be asking a couple of questions after this, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Please welcome Sarai.
Good morning. How are you guys? Good. So I'm the last. I don't want to repeat myself, so I'm trying to figure out what can I actually tell you that you haven't heard yet, right? Because I think we all understand that technology has historically injured victims, right? And also aids in supporting and recovering survivors. So as everyone has already expressed, technology is useful. technology is also harmful, right? Okay. So I think what I really want to do is just kind of recently, this has been a large discussion all over the US pertaining to technology in the human trafficking movement. And I think sometimes people think that it's less safe if you're trafficked online because we're not doing enough when it comes to our laws in changing how victims are exploited online. A recent national study showed that 72% of trafficking cases had exploitation online. And the sad reality is that 3 out of 4 children, sex trafficking victims in the US, have been exploited online. That's a large number. This is national, not just California, but national, 72%. I think we are all aware that we've had issues with different websites, such as Craigslist, right here in San Francisco. I'm sure a lot of you in the audience have fought to close down that section on Craigslist. And then recently with Backpage. Backpage was a struggle for law enforcement. However, we're succeeding in that case, right? But a lot of folks did not understand how Backpage was soliciting and exploiting and part of that crime. And I think this is something that we really need to focus on because a lot of websites such as Craigslist and Backpage are exploiting victims, are part of this criminal enterprise. And no one is really doing much to stop this. For years, these websites are porn sites, right? Where people are exploited, are trafficked, and we sit here and think that everyone on there are willing participants. Just when this issue started to become a real issue here in the Bay Area because it was so invisible, people still assumed that these victims were willing participants because we immediately labeled them as child and teen prostitutes. So what I'm saying to you is that it's great for everyone to come to these conferences and to do the work that we're doing, but it's not enough. Just like there's Facebook and Google, all of them put money towards this movement. They come up with different technologies to help it. But there has to be more than just that because we all have a responsibility. In a sense, we're all liable. So either we are part of the solution or we become part of the problem. Something I love to say because I don't think people really understand that there is so much that we have to do to fight this beast. Now I can go on and on, right, about the things that needs to happen. But I want to be positive at the same time. So I want to talk about some of the great things that have came about through technology. So we all know about the Human Trafficking National Hotline, right, and Be Free. We also know about the Cyber Tip Line by NCMEC, right, where communities can report trafficking. We also know about Thorn, which is the spotlight tool available to law enforcement across the country, and actually all 50 states use it. We also know about Microsoft Photo DNA, which aids in identifying images of children who are sexually exploited online and used by law enforcement. And then locally, have you guys heard about App 1193? Exactly. As well as locally, have you heard about reportjohn.org? Okay. So we're doing a lot of things, right? But it doesn't stop there. Have we also heard about SB 1693, Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act of Section 230? Have you guys? Okay, I don't see enough hands. So this is pretty much discussing the Communication Decency Act was never intended to protect websites that facilitate sex trafficking, right? So there needs to be an amendment to Section 230, which will actually help victims get the justice that they need. That's the main thing that you need to remember. that section will help victims get the justice that they need if they are exploited online. It will also enable federal liability protections for websites that assist, support, or facilitate a violation of federal sex trafficking laws, and enable state law enforcement officers, not just the Federal Department of Justice, to take action against individuals or businesses that violate federal sex trafficking laws. So that means the struggle that we're having, that we had with Backpage, we won't have it. Victims will be able to bring a lawsuit against companies, websites like Backpage, Craigslist, and so on and so on. Because see, now Backpage is down, right? But there's always a new website being created. And recently we talked about the dark web, right? I was at a conference, Shared Hope. Anybody there? Okay. And the comment was made, so if all of these websites are targeted, then everything's gonna go into the dark web, right? Is that gonna be horrible? Is that gonna be harder to recover victims? Yes, but then more focus would be on the dark web. More effort would be into coming up with solutions and technology to address the dark web, because I don't think enough is. I do believe that law enforcement is overwhelmed with so much that is happening to protect children, especially with the internet. But it's up to us to continue to fight. And one way to continue to fight is, again, to be on board with amending Section 230. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. My first question is to Sarai and Tony. What technologies do you wish for to better support survivors? And having been engaged in these discussions for a while, one app that I would love to see is somehow, I don't know how, but positive messaging to victims. Like a text or some way to reach them, to tell them that we care, that this room full of 150 people are working on this issue tirelessly, that they know that somebody cares. So I'll let Sarai go first.
Well, I think what I'll say again is that, we have some great technology right now that are supporting victims, right? Aiding in their rescue, their recovery. And so I think we're doing an excellent job. I love the fact that, you would love to see something that sends a message to victims that are being exploited. And I think really that message is being sent out, right? We have tons of awareness campaigns, tons of things happening. Yet I think the area that we're missing is that we're not using social media and websites and television enough to get that message out, right? I think on Facebook, we say a lot of stuff, right? But on television, we don't. When there's award shows, any, PSA on Channel 2, on Channel 7, right? Not just PBS, right? So something that is really going to grab their attention. We have billboards happening, right? And so that is telling them that something is happening, right? That this is human trafficking, and call this number, and etc. But there is no message to them, right? It's more of a message to the community and to the trafficker of, we see you, stop it, or this is what's gonna happen. So I think we're doing so much, but that awareness isn't enough. Just when I came in here through security, one of the security guards asked me, she says, oh, what's the conference about? Human trafficking. And then she said, oh, is that really bad in your neighborhood? Is that really bad in my neighborhood? It's really bad all over the world, here in California. So again, that clearly, immediately was like, wow, people ain't woke, right? So we can do so much better when it comes to awareness. And most importantly, this needs to be blasted everywhere. I think sometimes folks are afraid to have this conversation, are afraid because the reality is disturbing, right? The reality is disturbing because someone in this room can be a trafficker. Traffickers, pedophiles are everywhere. And that's scary to have to realize, especially when you have kids. But it's a conversation that needs to be had because that's how we protect and keep our children and ourselves and our community safe. So I think as much as we can do to bring awareness and have these campaigns blasted everywhere, is something that needs to happen. But I just have to say I am impressed with what we are doing.
Okay. I agree with probably everybody in this room that technology can serve its purpose and the awareness is out there. My concern also is when the trafficker has control of that information. You send something to a client or a victim in these cases, and the trafficker has that device or that information, and is not sharing that information with the individual. As you know, especially I see Jorge also here, that when we're doing inspections on the massage parlors, that we see the posters that are hanging up inside all these establishments. And when you ask the client, do you know what that means? They go, no, I have, but it's in your language. I still don't understand what it means. When I pointed out the last inspection last week, do you understand your rights that you're saying that you're getting paid $20 a day and you're working here 14 hours, and right above here it says that the minimum wage in California is this amount. Do you understand what that means? No, I don't understand what that means. How can you help me? So again, I agree, these campaigns are wonderful, but unless the client truly understands what that means, we're really not doing anything. We're just hanging up a bunch of posters and just telling them these things. We're not helping them succeed or actually getting out of the life.
Thank you.
That ain't me. I didn't do it.
Oh, my fault.
Next, I want to ask Jennifer, David, and Rebecca in that order. In what ways does the technology that you discussed contribute something new to the fight against human trafficking?
Right, thank you. So Palantir is at its core a data integration and data analysis company. So we work with a wide variety of institutions that have a kind of common problem, where they're trying to make sense of these massive disparate data sets in ways that are secure and responsible. And that's particularly important in the human trafficking field, where we're looking at data that's often about very vulnerable populations, and it's often highly sensitive data. And so considerations around privacy and civil liberties and around data security are really paramount to those institutions. And we work with local, state, and federal law enforcement, as well as with a number of different philanthropy clients in the nonprofit space. And I want to speak specifically to two of those organizations who are kind of our longest philanthropy clients in the human trafficking field. And so one of those is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And they have a database of about 90 million different records related to online commercial exploitation of children. And they're receiving between 15 and 20,000 new reports every single day. And so it's absolutely vital that they're able to make sense of that data at scale and to really be able to triage and prioritize those reports that go to law enforcement. And so Palantir helped analysts at NCMEC to really leverage the metadata around those reports in order to find links and connections between different cases, and in order to really kind of find that signal in the noise of this massive and rapidly growing database, so that they can more efficiently and effectively share that information with law enforcement, who in turn can more efficiently and effectively identify and recover child victims of exploitation, and also build stronger cases against those children's abusers. In another example in our work with Polaris, when analysts at Polaris kind of stepped back and looked at all the data they had through operating the US Human Trafficking Hotline, they saw this common pattern of traffickers fronting as legitimate commercial businesses, whether that's as a massage business, as a restaurant, as some other type of commercial entity. And as a result, many of these businesses have very robust data footprints. They're registering as formal businesses. They have business records, they have property records, they have online advertisements, there are lots of buyer review sites. But all of these data sets were siloed and very hard to cross-analyze. But when they used Palantir to bring that information together, they would see that what might look like an isolated case was actually part of a larger criminal network. And so in addition to providing more and better tactical information for law enforcement, they also could find these strategic patterns of information in the ways that traffickers would cross jurisdictions in their operations, or would hide what they were doing behind shell companies, or the ways that they would move their money. And that can then inform policy recommendations, prevention programming, better training, and better efforts to both identify and support survivors. But again, I really want to emphasize how incredibly important it is that all of this work is done, taking into consideration those very important data protection processes, because we're talking about data about very vulnerable populations, and so it's important that all of this data work always center that as a core principle.
So at iTunes, the philanthropic endeavors that we're involved with companies like Stop the Traffic and Deliver Fund, we deal with exactly the same issues. And so, organizations like, leveraging scrapers, like there's so many out there, but Flashpoint, organizations where they take stuff from the dark web, social media scraping, those are extremely important. But I work with a lot of financial institutions, and there's just such a wealth of information that is sitting there that if we connected those databases to all these other databases, we'll be able to see the linkages and the entity-link relationship of how things are occurring. But a lot of these organizations, they don't want to give up their data. They don't want to share it because it deals with a lot of personal identification information, right? So, in my mind, dealing with a problem of this magnitude, we need to get more of the stakeholders involved to start information sharing. And that includes law enforcement, other government, three-letter government entities, to create a larger repository, as we call it, to give analysts like that work at Deliver Fund or Stop the Traffic, give them the ability to track these things more efficiently. And once they get the information in front of them, they can see it, they can do something about it. But until those databases are blocked off, they can't operate as efficiently as possible. So I think that's all I have to add. Thank you.
Some of you may have noticed these little L, M, and H. I'll show you what that means. In case you haven't memorized the Marathi file, this is what I'm looking at down here. So, on the column, you can see the threads that I've put that were the green SFCAHT goals. On the top, these are the targets. This is a sample Marathi file. Yours would be theoretically more robust and more completed. How you organize the data is by choosing which relates to each other in scope, severity, and irreversibility. So scope is how widespread is this problem in relation to one another. Severity, how much damage can it do over time? And irreversibility, can it be reversed? If so, at what cost? Over how long? Then Marathi uses an algorithm to tally up the data that you put in to decide which goal, which is your priority, which is the target, where should you be going first if you want to most effectively and efficiently use your resources. So in this instance, it was, again, a sample, but very high would be allocation of government funds. Wouldn't that be nice? And something that's a bit lower would be the fact that it's a port or an airport city. Like I said, we just, not much to do about it. I'm really glad that Sarai brought up the human factor in this collective goal, because I do feel, and that was my example from before, that with community partnerships and this kind of effective and passionate public will to increase this can actually lead, as the algorithm says, to a relatively, it says medium, so maybe that wouldn't be your first target, but it could be something that has a low cost and a pretty good efficacy rate. There's a buzzword that we use in graduate school, and I'm sure some of you have heard it. It's called SMART goals. Eyes roll. But SMART goals stand for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. And in my experience, which admittedly, I'm only 25, I do believe that Marathi, above any other design tool I have seen and used, really does hit these SMART goals so effectively, so efficiently, and I truly believe that Marathi could be a game changer in human trafficking or any other human development target that we are trying to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. We're going to open the floor up to questions, and if I could get a couple of assistants with the microphones to take out to the audience. I do ask that you direct your question to a particular speaker and help us by identifying yourself. If you prefer not to identify yourself, that's okay too. And do we have any questions? A question from Chief Chaplain. Over here.
And this is for, I guess, for Jennifer and David. Jennifer, you talked about it earlier and touched on it a little bit, and it kind of goes into what Sarai said earlier about this being a global issue, and it's about cryptocurrency. You hear it popping up and then it'll drop down. You don't hear much about it. It's been used a lot with the ransomware demands, and just trying to figure out if this is going to be a new thing, because as Tony Flores said earlier, most of us in law enforcement, and not just the three-letter folks, sometimes the four-letter folks too, the SFPD, it's also involved in these things. We solve a lot of these cases by following the money. Kind of like the indictments we saw today, they follow the money. We follow the money, and with the cryptocurrency, my limited understanding is that it makes it almost impossible to follow the money because it's so anonymous. Do you think that that's something that's a growing concern, or do you think it's a fad that's fading?
Sure. So I guess the first thing I would say is that I think that there are significant barriers to entry within cryptocurrency that will make it challenging to be used in a really widespread way to facilitate exploitation. So we will see some cases, especially in online exploitation media related to children, where people are buying and trading that material using cryptocurrencies. But I've never really seen a case, this may be changing, where someone, for example, pays for a sex trafficking victim in person via cryptocurrency, because so many buyers are opportunistic in some ways, and right now cryptocurrencies haven't really infiltrated daily life sufficiently that your average buyer will necessarily have access to that. That may change over time, but so far I would say that we don't see widespread instances of that, though we do see some in the online space. That said, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children has a financial coalition against child pornography, and they put out a report earlier this year specifically looking at the role that cryptocurrency plays in facilitating online exploitation of children. So I would definitely recommend that. You can find it on their website. And that also talks about some of the strategies that they've seen to get around those issues with anonymity. Because in many cases, yes, this does make it harder to follow the trail, but part of how these cryptocurrencies work is that, well, people are in some ways anonymous, they're not as anonymous as they think that they are. And oftentimes, at some point, they want to get that money out of the cryptocurrency into real world dollars. And those are points where they can be tracked. And so there's some interesting strategies there and a lot of information about kinds of the trends that the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children is seeing. So I definitely recommend looking at that.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is kind of what my point was earlier, is that what your cryptocurrency, at some point they're going to want to move it into a different direction. And a lot of my financial customers that I deal with every single day, they have this problem and they see people doing, anti-money laundering sort of activity. And a lot of that times those are paired with activity that are going on in the cyber realm that they're not seeing. And they struggle with it every single day. So I think the one thing that I would really add to this is that as techniques and practices of these criminals occur, we're going to have to adjust accordingly. And just like Jennifer was saying, there are markers along the way. There's data along the way that we can still track that we need to leverage. But really, we need to focus on getting these other stakeholders involved to break down those solid barriers of data, so we can start leveraging even more efficiently.
So my question is about for Antonio and David, as far as education in our schools. I see that we talk a lot about in our community and what our role is, but like with sex education, I don't see this being taught to our most vulnerable population, which is our children. Like Mr. DeSouza said, that his kids were able to go to school, but nowhere in there were they teaching about any type of putting posters up as far as human trafficking. We have a lot of things going on in college about rape and assault, but we're not putting it down to the most vulnerable population because kids see a lot more than what we see, and they talk with a lot more of their friends. So how can we address dealing with that population, because we see a lot of kids come into hospitals and try to wean out what's the possibility of labor or human trafficking that could be going on in the home.
Before we hear from Tony on this, I just want to point out Benita Hopkins here from Love Never Fails has run a program for 7th graders in the Oakland Unified School District on this topic. And I also sit on the San Francisco Unified School District, and as a result of the Mayor's Task Force on Anti-Human Trafficking, we passed a resolution to introduce human trafficking curriculum into the health curriculum, which starts in the 5th grade. And then finally, SFCAHT does host an annual teen poster and essay contest in January. But I'll let Tony take the question.
I agree with you 100%. And we would, as a father of 3 daughters, the youngest being 10 years old, but that's another story. I can tell you right now, we need to get into, not the high schools, but we need to get into the middle schools and elementary school, 100%. This information needs to be out. It was almost like, I hate to call it like it's the campaign against drug use, but we have to talk about it. And not only in the public schools, but the private schools. The private schools, these are hidden private schools also, so we need to show, hey, we need to get in there. We need to, because it crosses over so many times. So I know that we've all worked together on this issue, and we're very passionate about that they have to know that they cannot be afraid of law enforcement. And that's a big bridge. That's something that I know the chief is passionate about, is to train other officers to say, hey, you need to get out of the car. You need to actually have a dialogue with individuals and stop going by. You need to show that people should not fear us, but actually come to us. We are peace officers, always. And we're there to provide peace, and we want that information. That's the only way we're going to be able to do this, is especially if we can go into the classroom or go into those areas that children congregate and say, listen, these are the signs, these are the things to say, and listen to what they're saying. Again, they may not be saying anything, I think Harold said it perfectly. You know, his children are going to school and they don't have the right clothing in there. Well, that should have been the clue for maybe possibly the teacher to recognize, hey, something right then and there says something. What's up with this thing? Is there anything I can do to help you? Is there anything that we can do? What's going on in your home? And it's not all about the homework. It's not about getting the assignments done. And again, it's a dialogue that we definitely need to have.
Vinny and Laura let me know that California Governor Brown signed the Human Trafficking Prevention and Education Act on the 7th of this month, which mandates information about human trafficking for all 7th to 11th graders in the state of California. Let's see, there was a question over here. Yes.
Hi there, my name is Robin and I'm with the Heat Watch program of the Alameda County District Attorney's Office. And I'm curious about, you guys were all speaking in regards to looking at the dark web and seeing that there is obviously a ton of information and really horrible exploitation done online. But I think the only reason there is this is because there's a market for viewing those images and actually receiving that, right? And so I'm curious about what you guys are doing and what your agencies are doing to focus specifically on the demand side. And, you know, I know that we've seen in Seattle, there's some prosecution efforts in regards to the chat rooms, where a lot of these buyers are normalizing their exploitative behavior. And there's other ways that they're using technology really to at least first learn about how to exploit and then going forward with that purchase. So I'd like to hear about what each of your agencies is doing.
As you know, a while ago when we started looking at the demand portion as far as the buyers, we've been very passionate about that. Before, how we used to do business was we would send a decoy out there on the corner and have that decoy be a proposition or solicit for the acts of prostitution. Then we would come in and get that individual. I knew right then and there that that was not the right way to do this. We needed to get onto the internet and get on sites and do it like they do it. And it was a big game changer the very first time. And the very first time, the very first person that knocked on our door at a hotel was a doctor. And we knew right then and there this was a big game changer. We needed to see and we need to expand what we do in our operations. So with that, we've actually taken advantage of all those internet sites, and that's where we've gone. And I'm very familiar with the case in Seattle, and this is where individuals were invited into a chat room with other persons that bought sex for money with other people, and they would talk about how this one individual, if she wasn't good or he wasn't good, that they would give them a bad rating. If they needed to step up their game to go forward, or they're going to be blacklisted. Well, in the back of my head, that kind of sounds like pimping, pandering. That kind of sounds like this kind of conversation. And we are looking at that way. And I actually we talked about that before, so we're moving forward to that direction.
I'm going to take one or two more questions and we'll have a quick break before our 11 o'clock.
I have a question, I think, for David, but anyone who could answer this, which is if someone could talk about blockchain technology and how that can be used to track trafficking in the supply chain.
Well, IBM is definitely like on the forefront of using blockchain technology. Oh, sorry about that. There, is that better? Testing. Yeah, I don't know if I can add too much in terms of just specifically speaking about blockchain. So blockchain is technology that IBM uses in a variety of use cases, especially in the financial industry. But I don't know if Jennifer has a little more detail on it, but happy to.
Yeah, so the specific use cases I've seen in the supply chain space are kind of two different potential use cases. So the first would be basically equipping workers with their own sort of unique code that would then allow them to do this kind of distributed ledger technology so that you'll have a better sense of who is involved at what stages along the supply chain. And by doing that, right now, one of the biggest challenges in labor trafficking in these kind of manufacturing sectors is that you'll have maybe a brand name company that we're all familiar with, but they're not the ones operating the factories. They're working with a number of different second tier and third tier suppliers. and it can be very hard for them to follow that trail and see which factories are responsible for which goods and what are the conditions at that factory. And so if you're able to essentially, in the manufacturing ledgers, encrypt people's individual identities, you can then trace back that supply chain and better understand what are those conditions of those workers. The other use case I've seen is kind of taking that concept and basically incentivizing corporations to use blockchain because you can more quickly, and you might be able to speak to this more easily, validate and move money. And so you can kind of incentivize corporations, you should do this, it'll actually increase your profits, and at the same time, it will allow you to have this better level of insight into the supply chain. Because one of the concerns that the field has always had is that a lot of corporations don't necessarily want that insight, because as soon as you have it, you can become legally liable, you have to do something. And so if you can both incentivize that while also giving them the technology to do it, you kind of create this more powerful force to kind of push people in that direction. So I hope that's somewhat helpful.
Do we have a final question for Rebecca or Sarai?
Kai Smith. I'm a student at Summit Shasta in Daly City. I'm here with some of my friends. We're in an advanced human rights group in our school. And I had a question mostly for Soraya about how we can use technology to talk to younger kids about this. We talked about it a little bit in schools, but I see younger kids using technology now. It's more available to them, even 4 and 5-year-olds sometimes on social media. So how do we use how do we direct social media campaigns towards those younger kids and make it more understandable to them?
Great question. So one thing I want to just put out, so Alameda County Heat Watch, a couple years ago, they did a book that was animated. What's the name of it, Robin? Audrey, yes. And that was something that the young people really paid attention to because it talked about sexual exploitation and how it happens and what young people go through, and it also gave resources. And so I think really in schools and just different ways of really catching their attention is to make animated video, right? Because all kids love looking at animation regardless of how old we are, right? Even 37 and I still look at animation, right? So it's something that captures our attention and it's interesting and it's entertaining, but it also can teach us something. And so I would definitely recommend, and this is something I've told other people that create documentaries and films, create something that is animated to talk about human trafficking so that people as young as 4, 7, 10 will want to pay attention to it, will be intrigued to look at it. And I think that's a way where you can actually tell them about human trafficking, tell them about sexual exploitation, tell them about who are the ones that are pretenders. And that's what I call them. Traffickers, predators, they're pretenders, right? Because they're wearing all these different faces and they're pretending to be able to get trust, right? Because once a young person trusts them, just an ounce of trust, they can easily manipulate and groom them. So if they know what that looks like, then they can protect themselves. Because a lot of young people don't understand that a teacher can be a trafficker. Anyone can be a trafficker, and like it was brought out before, every child is at risk, right? So not just in urban schools, but also suburban schools. Animated series should be available to every kid. And it would be great if teachers would actually show it in their classrooms, right? If we had an assembly, if every school in the month of January had an assembly and showed that animated video, from elementary to middle school to high school, we would actually really be doing something at that point in time. Because again, like was brought out, we're doing great things, right? But there's so much more that can be done. And even in the school districts across the Bay Area, across the US, so much more can happen. But that would be powerful if regionally in the Bay Area, every single school did something in January for Human Trafficking Month and showed an animated video. that would be powerful. If every high school, if high school linked up, and this is something I've said, right? From Oakland High to Berkeley High to schools in San Francisco, if it was, again, something regional is going on, because we have so much separation. We talk about collaboration, but there's so much separation, and this is brought out even with technology. There's so much separation, there's not enough collaboration. And that's what it takes, because traffickers, they collaborate. From state to state, from county to county, from city to city. We don't do that, which is why we're always over here and they're over there. And we wonder why we can't touch them, because we're not really collaborating. It's a buzzword. We throw it around and we don't really do it. So, to your question, I think if we did something that's animated to speak to the young people, we will get their attention.
We have one last comment before the break.
I was fortunate enough to get involved. I'm Sandra Gordon with National Council of Jewish Women San Francisco, the oldest women's organization in the United States, and we're supporting today. I was fortunate enough to find out that there were free parenting classes offered before I even had children, and I nudged them. I kept, trying to get in, and eventually I did, for these free parenting classes. And I think they're so important because I was involved before I was married and before I even had children. It's an important aspect and free. And I kept involved even after I got married and had children with these parenting classes. And I think it's so important to, train parents or non-parents, what to do before they even get involved with bringing up families, whether they unfortunately have children before they're married, and being taken advantage of, but to know themselves and know what to do to recognize not to be a victim.
Thank you, Sandra. We will now be taking a quick break. I'd like to ask the panelists at 11:10 to come forward at around 11, and we'll be hearing from Supervisor Katie Tang at 11. So please be back in your seats at 11. Thank you very much.
If we can make policies that will influence these businesses so that their profits are higher, they're going to get on board. And I think that that's a first step that we can take. I mean, think about it. Before we had seatbelts, there was no rules against, having a car without seatbelts. And now we have to have seatbelts and airbags. And cars are safer because we implemented policies and laws to force these companies to do this. So I think when it comes to human trafficking, we can do the same thing. And that is by forcing these companies to adhere to a standard of human rights and anti-human trafficking policies within their supply chains. And I just think that it's going to take all of us, and businesses included.
Thank you.
We'll just pass it. Is it written?
So, good morning or good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here. It's wonderful to see a room full of people who are also committed to the same issues, which is to stop human trafficking once and for all. In terms of the business community, I mean, one of the things I will say, and this really goes to what we just heard from Russell, and that is pass laws or create policy. Well, in California, we did create a policy that really pulls in businesses, and it was SB 1193 that requires businesses, certain businesses, to post posters that give information, and more particularly, the phone number of national hotlines for people who may be being trafficked and don't realize it, and they can see themselves in the verbiage, or for people that are in the community that don't know about this and read it and become more educated to say, wow, the next door neighbor has a cleaning lady who never leaves the house or whatever. And so we don't enforce 1193 the way we should. We have a very active group in my county, and many of you know that we created an app for people in the community to be able to go to a business, like I went to a restaurant once, didn't see the sign, pulled up my app, found the restaurant in my app and pushed the red button, and a couple days later, the inspectors from my office were there with the poster. Now, this is an important tool because the first offense is a $500 fine, and it's administrative. The second, it's $1,000 for every day that they violate this law. So there are some real teeth to it for us doing that. So we have days of action, we have things like that. But I will say, let's start with enforcing the laws we have on the books. And I'm just going to shout out to a group of women who I just have the greatest admiration for, and that's the Sisters Against against Human Trafficking, because they're out there with our app, I will say, and they are out there going to businesses and making sure that those businesses are in compliance. So that's one really basic way that we can engage more businesses than are now. But I think that there are a lot of businesses that don't realize the role they play in recognizing trafficking or in their own role in trafficking. So I will tell you that part of what I do is I look at the different businesses in my community, and then I go speak to them. So I speak to the realtors, and I generally start with them and say, you're probably wondering why the DA's here. And trust me, when I was driving here, I was wondering, what am I going to say to you, realtors? But the truth is, we both have eagle eye. You're looking for blight, you're looking for things that are going to take down the value of a neighborhood. I'm looking for potential criminal behavior. Realtors they go into houses all the time, and they don't need a warrant to go in like I do or the police do. So the realtors have become a very important partner, and you know, realtors are everywhere, especially now in this market. We look at, we also have been working with the building trades, because they're oftentimes the ones that are cluing us in that industry is actually exploiting workers. They're not paying their workers' comp. They're not paying them. Some of them are immigrants, and they're holding that over their head. Those are the people that become our partners. In some of the strongest labor trafficking cases we've prosecuted have started with our partners in the trades, telling us who's doing what wrong. The contractors who are applying and competing for the same jobs or the same contracts are the ones who are coming to us saying, there's no way this construction company could do it for the price they bid. So they go in and take a look and say, wow, they have all these workers that are not being paid, or they're, all the things that we know about. So reaching out to our labor council, reaching out to our trades, reaching out to those industries that are legitimate and want to have those that are breaking the law step forward and be held accountable. And from a prosecution standpoint, we have a lot of tools to do that. We heard about Dennis Herrera's lawsuit, and I know that the work being done in San Francisco is really powerful around shutting down businesses or going into businesses and either remediating or prosecuting. But we have civil violation tools also, and we need to use it. One of my people that know me know. My first saying that I live by is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So I'm always going to be at a table. The second one is do your job. And frankly, this is what I say to those of us in my industry and we need to do our job. We need to pay attention. And when we get a complaint or we hear about something, we can't just put it on the shelf. We need to address it, and we need to stop it. The last thing I'll say is that we have to start looking at some of these businesses as organized crime, because particularly in the brothel industry and in the massage parlor, not as much, but in the brothels, particularly neighborhood brothels, we now realize just how organized the criminals are that are holding people in slavery in that regard, and then use all the tools that we have available to us. Last thing I want to say is it's very tricky, complicated, we've all said that, but the truth is we have a lot of immigrant people who are here who are afraid to speak up, because they are afraid of what could happen to them. And that's why our relationship with HSI is so important, so that when we do find victims who are immigrants who are scared to say something, because of the current climate, which is not just politics, it's our humanity, frankly, and that we need to do everything we can so that people know they can step forward and speak up. And then from my perspective, that help them get visas to stay here because they are victims of human trafficking. And we can't ignore that resource that we have to help people not live in slavery and live in exploitation, even though they may not have a legal status here in the country. Thank you.
So I'm not going to reiterate everything that this wonderful panel that I'm on has said, but I do want to bring up 2 points. First of all, I just want to say I was overwhelmed to tears by keynote speaker D'Souza. Just amazing to see what you've been through, what your family's been through, and where you are today. And as a child of immigrants from India, I can only imagine and wonder if my dad's journey here could have been the same, and I would maybe not exist today. So Mr. D'Souza, just phenomenal words. As I look around the room, the 2 things that come to mind when we talk about trafficking and this group are the 2 C's, collaboration and consistency. And here I sit looking at my dear friend and colleague in city government, Katie Tang and Sergeant Flores. And I remember in 2012 when I first met Katie in a Terraville Community Police room, and she said, Ronnie, I want you to work on a project with me. We've got to deal with these massage parlors popping up all over District 4 and what's going on behind them. And here we are 5 years later still dealing with the same issue and making traction. But you cannot stop what you're doing. And you cannot do it alone. So that's why collaboration and consistency are the 2 most important things. Nobody is a one-man machine. I can tell you from, Judge Wormy knows, from the collaboration that we had to get that case to fruition, there is no way I couldn't have done it without Tony and his team, as well as every other agency in San Francisco, from the victims advocates to juvenile probation to everybody in my office. So when you look at businesses and what needs to happen, you have to get out at the grassroots level and you have to collaborate with the merchants associations, with the district merchants associations, with the city agencies that deal with the merchants associations. You cannot just do a small sweep of the neighborhood and think that you've solved the problem. You need to ask assistance of the Board of Supervisors, of the police department, of the building code inspectors, of DPH, of the health inspectors, all of those agencies collectively working and being consistent in being able to track and to hold accountable businesses that are not doing what they're supposed to be doing is the key to making a dent in this problem. So for me, those 2 things are super important.
Thank you.